Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Advanced Student Affairs, Leadership and Management, hosted by ACPA's Mid-Level Community of Practice. MLCOP was created 3 years ago to provide a home for mid-level professionals within student affairs. There has always been a need for more programs, events, dialogues, and opportunities for research geared towards mid-level practitioners. We have some great webinars and opportunities lined up for this upcoming year. Please keep a close eye on your My ACPA community or the MLCOP Facebook group and Twitter accounts for future opportunities. Today's discussion will revolve around strategies and frameworks for effective administrative practice in student affairs. MLCOP will be monitoring the social media back channel, including the Facebook group and Twitter accounts. You can write your questions there or in the chat box provided within your dashboard in the My Webinar program. This is a preferred method so that your questions can be answered. We will do our best to cover all the questions and comments that come in. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Tom Seeger, the Vice President for Student Affairs and Affiliate Graduate Programs. Without further ado, I will transfer the opportunity over to Tom.
Thank you, Nikki, very much. I am very honored to be here. I know you all have busy lives, and even though our friends who do not work in student affairs think that we spend their summers relaxing on campus, we all know we have tons of work to do throughout the school year, particularly during the summer as we get ready for new students. So again, thank you for being here. My primary role is I serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs at Shepherd University, and I have all the typical student affairs areas within my portfolio, and I have amazing colleagues who make it possible for me to do things like this today. In fact, most of what I learn on this topic, it comes from my colleagues, both within student affairs and throughout the university. So I want to acknowledge them as I come to you, not as the expert and the sage, but just as someone who's on this journey with you. And so I want to give you a little bit of background about the topic and kind of why I chose to, focus on this topic. So when I think back to my own graduate preparation experiences, I learned a lot about theory. Most of it I still remember. I learned a lot about understanding students and even understanding the systems of higher education at all levels. But the one thing I didn't learn much about was how to handle the demands of leadership and management as a student affairs administrator. No one ever taught me how to handle all the emails, how to handle budgeting and supervision, and all the parts that we have to be able to navigate to be effective in our roles. And so about 5 years ago, I put together a class called Student Affairs, Management, and Supervision. It's a class that's an elective in the graduate program where I also serve as an affiliate faculty member. And I put together that class partly because I felt that a lot of our students were leaving our grad program without that experience. And so my faculty colleagues and I thought it'd be a good idea to present a class on that. But I also wanted to teach the class because it forced me to read literature to become much more effective at my role. And so with that, this ambitious list of outcomes for this webinar is sort of an attempt to cover very quickly, very succinctly, all these different topics. And so kind of as we get started, if we could use the chat, Nikki, I'd love to have folks just quickly share what brought them to this webinar. And I think as you enter that, I think it will likely share it with everyone. But if you're okay with that, I'd love to just take a moment or so to give the group a chance to share what brought them to this particular webinar.
Audience members, please enter your responses in the chat feature designated to all entire audience.
Great. So I see one response, skills to be ready for a mid-level role. That's important. I can see these responses here. What else? So I see one response so far. So in general, we either want to be able to prepare ourselves for that next step, or we want to learn how to be successful where we are. And I do think it's important that we see our own professional journey in terms of our effectiveness as our responsibility. And so as much as we want to be competent in understanding students and the academy and the systems in which we work in, we also want to be effective within our own domains of being administrators in particular. And so what I want to start with is everyone's favorite topic, and that's effectively managing a budget. So if I only had one sentence to give you about managing a budget, I would say ultimately you need to know how much money you have, how much you anticipate spending, and what you need to spend it on. And I would end it at that. The additional component is you want to know where your funding comes from. So if we were sitting in a meeting looking at budgets as a division, and with the division of student affairs having multiple departments, we'd find that each budget likely has a different funding source. And so knowing where your revenue sources come from, how they fund your budget, whether it's from a specific fee. So for example, our colleagues who operate auxiliaries such as residence life or student unions or dining services, it's pretty easy and clear to see where their funding comes from because they generate their own funding. Even though that funding may come from different fees and even different retail operations, we can clearly see where that comes from. But if you take an office that provides a service, like a dean of students office, the funding source can be a little bit more, I'd say, cloudy. So in my experience, the deans of students offices are generally not by themselves revenue generating. They're often supported either by an auxiliary operation that is supervised by a dean of students office, or they're funded from general tuition dollars, or they may be funded from the state. But it's important to know your budget funding source because in some ways that gives you a clue as to how you are accountable. Who are you supposed to be serving? So for example, if your funding source comes from an auxiliary like your student union or your dining services operation, part of your budget must be used to support the ongoing operation of that particular area. And so when I often ask folks, what are your highest priorities within your unit, within your department? And then I ask, well, tell me how you're spending your money. When I see there's a disconnect, I see kind of a red flag that comes up. And so it's important to align your fiscal resources with your highest priorities as part of the budget planning process. One should be identifying what the highest priorities are and how one's fiscal resources will help one achieve those high priorities. And whether you have a budget of a few $100s as your hall director, or whether you have a multi-million-dollar budget, your highest priorities and your most important outcomes should be traced to how you invest your financial resources. And so if I had a chance to sit down with someone who asked the question, how do I figure out how to pace my money and make sure it lasts? Because no matter how much money you have within a budget, again, whether it's a couple $100s or millions of dollars, there is no limit to our capacity to spend other than the limits that we either impose internally or the limits of our organization. And so one of the strategies that I use, and I'm fortunate I have great colleagues to help me do this, is that I manage by what we call period. A period is essentially a month. Within the accounting world, we say periods. Within a year, there are 12 periods. However, the fiscal year, at least within my state and most public institutions, the fiscal year begins July 1st. And we have 12 periods between July 1st and June 30th. And whether we use a separate enterprise resource program that we use to kind of manage the budget at the university level, or whether at the department or division level you're using Excel, you can simply track your spending by month. And one of the strategies I often use is kind of track that spending by quarter. So give you a good example. If I have a $100,000 budget and I find that I spent half that budget within the first 2 periods, that's a problem, because I may end up having more time than I have dollars. And so it's important to pace that out. You also need to anticipate where your biggest expenses are.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'll listen for the door.
Okay. One of the things that I often talk about with folks is to outline what they anticipate to be their largest expenditures. Now, which expenses are monthly? Which ones are more episodic? What are you responsible for paying for that you may not know about? So independent of whatever your level is, whether you are entry level and you have only a few things you need to worry about covering with the budget, or whether you're trying to run a department or a division, you should always know up front what those expenses are. The best way to do that is to look at the prior year data. So I hope you're at an institution where you can look at prior year budget data. And you can, as you kind of manage those labor and expenses, you can look at what were the prior year trends. That will give you a good sense of what you may need to anticipate. And if you can see for the past 5 years, at the end of every year, you've always been over budget, you now have an opportunity to figure out why you're over budget and how to accommodate that. It also gives you an opportunity to request more funding if you are achieving all the outcomes that you are targeted and tasked to achieve, and yet you're finding out you don't have enough money to do it, and you're doing what you have to do, not just what you want to do, then it may be an opportunity to ask for more funds. And so the next item here, assessing outcomes associated with your budget. You have to be clear about what you're charged to accomplish with the fiscal resources you've been given. And you have to also ask yourself the question, what if I had to start with $0? What if I had to start from having no money at all? How would I build a budget from there? I think about it like planning a vacation. Think about what money do I need to have to get where I'm going? What do I want to do once I get there? And what money will I need to get back home? And so the technique I just described very briefly as I think about my own vacation is called zero-based budgeting. And it's the one strategy to use to quickly and succinctly align your outcomes with budget. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the year-over-year comparisons can be a great tool to see what the trends have been, what those who come before you have had to navigate, and how you might need to make adjustments for the future. But ultimately, I would tell everyone you should spend a decent amount of time, no matter what your budget is, monitoring your budget. And if you get to the point in your career where you have colleagues whose job it is to monitor that, you should always have a sense of where you are, and realizing that there are essentially 3 main considerations we have when it comes to our spending and the demands of our spending. So there are the internal mandates. Those are things that as an institution or a department or a unit you've agreed to fund. And then there are the external mandates, And generally, those mandates are influenced beyond our institution sometimes, and definitely beyond our departments. But that's what the institution will say you have to do. And then we have just the expected cost of doing business. So utilities is a great example. The one constant that I personally have to always be aware of within my own context is the cost of utilities, because that's the one factor that we have to have lights on, we have to have water, and we have to have fuel. And so those are kind of things you have to think about and plan each year as you plan out your budget. And so I share that kind of as a brief overview, but I think it's one of the skills one has to have. And later on in the webinar, I will share some great resources that I've personally used to help me learn more about managing a budget. And I would encourage you as well, if you can, as long as your supervisor supports it, meet with the budget person for your department and for your institution. Take a basic accounting class. Of course, now you can get on YouTube and learn some basic accounting. Those skills will certainly help you as you think about that next step in your career. And it's a great resource for helping be much more effective at managing a budget and talking about planning a budget. Next one thing I want to talk about is supervision styles. So I listed here 5 different supervision styles that are pretty commonly found everywhere. And the way I describe them, there's the first style of simply kind of not caring too much and kind of letting things go and not being a supervisor who's super involved. There's a supervisor who simply says this is how it's going to be and who does not consult or talk to folks, who just simply makes decisions. I'm not recommending that. There is the participative style where it's likely that that supervisor is someone who engages in dialogue and seeks input from others. There's a transactional supervisor who simply says, if you do X, I will give you Y. And while sometimes that style seems functional and ideal, what can happen is folks don't have buy-in. And there's transformational, where supervisor spends a lot of time getting to know the values and the desires of one staff and tries to shape the outcomes in a collaborative way. The difference between transformational and participative is that the transformational supervisor spends a lot more time and invests a lot more effort in incorporating the values and ideals and desires of the staff and shaping an outcome that looks a lot different because it's included input and influence from a staff. And so my own personal style is a mix of participative and transformational. And I find that it encourages me to delegate various tasks with an outcome because my staff is bought into and got excited about whatever we're working on. And so therefore, I don't have to be the one who's responsible for everything. And so think about what is your own natural style and what style do you find that your staff reacts to the most, and be willing to be a little flexible, but also take responsibility for those outcomes you've been tasked to make happen. I think it's also important to be really open and even discuss with your staff your own supervision style. Ask them for feedback. Ask them what they need, and be okay with making adjustments and being very transparent about how you were still on your own journey. I tell my staff all the time that I'm still on a journey of learning how to be effective. And in my own particular role, I have about 9 direct reports, which include 2 assistant vice presidents, a dean of students, and several directors. But I'm still on my own learning journey, and I'm very open about my style. And I think if you were to ask my staff, they would also tell you how I supervise now has changed a lot over the decade or more that we've worked together. So let's talk about supervising people. This tends to be the area that people like the least. I have a lot of friends who are now full-time faculty who at one time had been administrators, and they say the thing that they love the most about being faculty is not the fact that they have a 9-month calendar of being in the classroom in the summer to work and be prepared for the following year. What they love the most is they don't supervise anyone. Supervision can be the one thing that makes or breaks a work experience, and that can make or break the experience both from the supervisee's perspective and the supervisor's perspective. And so it's important that at every step along the way within the supervising relationship, it's really important that there is time spent clarifying expectations early and often. And so what I mean by that, at every level, there should be some discussion, almost on a weekly basis, on what the expectations are, both for the role overall, both the role of the supervisor and supervisee, and also the functional aspects of the job. So there should never be a lack of clarity. I listed here provide periodic feedback. At least in my institution, we just concluded the annual evaluation process. It's that required evaluation that takes place once a year. But if the only time you are either giving or receiving feedback is during the once-a-year annual evaluation, I would say as a supervisor, you're not quite being effective. And as a supervisee, if your supervisor is only giving you feedback once a year, unfortunately, you're not getting the support you need to grow and be effective. And so that feedback is important, because not only is it important to give that constructive feedback on how we can improve, but also to be given feedback when we do something well, so that we are affirmed in our roles, but also so we know what we've done right and how we should continue to enhance that. So one of the ways we do that is through our one-on-one meetings. When in previous experiences around the topic of supervision, I've talked about with a fellow presenter about the use of the one-on-one meetings and the use of a structured one-on-one agenda. Every one-on-one meeting should have an agenda, and whether it's an agenda that's printed out or whether it's shared electronically, but an agenda that talks about the main things we need to cover during the meeting. And also part of that agenda should include an opportunity to check in. How are you doing? What do you need from me? What can I do for you? And this is, again, this is from the voice of the supervisor. That should always be part of the one-on-one meeting. That one-on-one meeting should also provide an opportunity for feedback and assessment of supervisee's performance. And sometimes assessing the performance may sound intimidating. I don't want to do that because that makes me out to not be supportive. Well, actually, assessing performance is as much about telling people what they've done right and what they're doing well versus those things they might need to look at differently. And so I'm going to end this section about revisiting expected outcomes. In every particular role, there are daily outcomes, things we have to do on a daily basis. But independent of our role, there's always things that we need to be doing on a weekly, monthly, or even a bi-monthly basis. And those outcomes should be very clear. And if you are a supervisee and those outcomes have not been expressed to you, I encourage you to develop those outcomes and present them to your supervisor and ask your supervisor if your supervisor believes these are the outcomes that you're expected to deliver. And it's something that I learned early on in my experience as a senior student affairs officer, going to my supervisor who oftentimes didn't really have the time to really get into the nuts and bolts of my role, but I knew there are outcomes that my supervisor wanted to be able to point to reference when it came to my area. And so I took it upon myself to get that feedback, and it was probably one of the most meaningful things I've done in terms of getting feedback and putting the responsibility on me to get that feedback. So institution-wide influence, you might wonder, well, why do we want to talk about institution-wide influence? What does that mean? This is not about controlling your institution. This is not about trying to gain influence in a way that's not authentic and in a way that does not reflect integrity. It's really about trying to be a good steward for your own unit, your own department, for your division, and for the institution. And so one of the ways to enhance your own skills is to seek opportunities to collaborate. So that can include asking your supervisor if you can join a committee that may be an institution-wide committee. It could mean identifying a particular department that your own department works with a lot, and it may be an opportunity for you to deepen that relationship by taking on a project. But the collaboration and the outcomes associated with that collaboration are one of the ways in which you can have institution-wide influence. Once you can demonstrate you have an expertise and a passion, and I think you have to have both together. I think you have to have the passion and the desire, and you also have to have the expertise and knowledge to create outcomes. It's amazing what can happen. So I'll share a couple examples. I once had a colleague who loved talking about in his own personal life demonstrating sustainability. And he loved doing it so much, and this person worked within residence life. He started looking at other opportunities to expand sustainability. So not only was he looking at sustainability within his own residential area that he supervised, he then began looking at sustainability as how the entire department could participate in that. And then he expanded it by asking if he could create a sustainability task force for the university, collaborating with facilities management in particular, and then deciding to collaborate with colleagues in the academic departments, realizing that the academic departments were large consumers of materials. And now, looking back 5 years later, we have a thriving sustainability task force that has multiple senior staff as part of this task force. And the reality is the person who started it, the person is no longer here. He's actually moved on to another job. But that influence has lasted because he took his own passion and found an opportunity to collaborate and then had a lasting impact on the institution. And so champion other people's initiatives. I often say that it's important for you to be able to articulate the values of your own area, but it's even more important to be able to go into another person's area and be really good about identifying their needs, their desired outcomes, and their initiatives. And so one of the examples that's most salient within my own institution is a collaboration between student affairs, enrollment management, and academic affairs. And we each, within a short amount of time, can quickly talk about the top priorities in each of those areas and how we each support each other's top priorities. Now, part of that only happens through seeking opportunities to collaborate, maybe being on committees together, maybe taking the time to have lunch with someone and picking their brain about their area, asking what their needs are. In fact, finding opportunities to where you might be able to provide resources to advance other people's areas. One example that comes to mind is an opportunity that happened between student affairs and academic affairs that continued for several years. The nursing department at our institution received a multi-million-dollar grant to diversify the nursing workforce in our region. What the grant required ongoing diversity and social justice workshops, as well as an annual conference that would invite hospital and other healthcare professionals throughout the region to the campus. And so the director of the nursing program and the dean who oversees that area reached out to Student Affairs. And on our campus, our Student Affairs has a very active interest and engagement around that topic. And so we saw a great opportunity to collaborate. And it's a collaboration that still continues. And there are other ventures where we have taken advantage of that synergy that we created at this point. I think it's been about 5 years. We still leverage that synergy in other areas. And so if we were to kind of label kind of a mindset, it's almost the mindset of how can I be a servant leader? How can I help this initiative and not focus on what's in it for me? And so in the example I just shared, the resources that we provided, whether expertise or talent, and a modest amount of funding. The modest amount of funding was probably within the few $100 ranges for helping with catering and helping with other things. But it was a willingness to reach out and to give our time to an effort is what gained the university-wide influence, because now our colleagues in other areas see us and see the staff who were involved with this venture. They see those folks as folks who are competent, folks whose input and guidance is valued. And so part of it is about, again, offering your talents to others. I think within Student Affairs, we have a lot of talent to offer our colleagues. I think sometimes we may not do a good job of expressing that talent, sharing that talent. And so I think it's really, really important that we seek opportunities to share that talent, and that does provide opportunities for institution-wide influence. The last thing I'll say on this topic is just finding ways to say yes. I think it's easy, and it's funny because I'm saying about finding yes. In a few slides, I'll talk to you about saying no. But for right now, we're focusing on yes. And it's easy for us to find reasons not to reach out, not to work with others, to stay within our own departments or even within our own units within a department. But the way in which we're able to grow and find other opportunities as we look to advance our own careers and advance our contribution is through our collaboration. It's finding ways to say yes or to get to a yes when the response has been no. And so let's talk about another pleasant topic, addressing conflict among staff. And I know that providing feedback can be very difficult. And I want to quickly mention the feedback before I get deeply into this particular slide. Oftentimes when we provide feedback, we add our emotion, our feeling, and all the things that are certainly important and valid, but may cloud the opportunity to get feedback. And so it's very important in giving feedback to be objective to what we witnessed or what someone else may have witnessed and conveyed to us. And to always start off with what was witnessed and then talk about the impact of that witnessed behavior on others. And so when I think about resolving conflict among staff, I often find that unresolved conflict has a high cost. In the work we do, we work through relationships. It's one of our most used resources, our most used tool as professionals. And when that tool experiences damage, and when I say damage in terms of unresolved conflict, we lose our effectiveness. We have usually you need 2 or more people to have some kind of conflict. When 2 or more people are in conflict, those folks, whether they realize it or not, they could have an influence on an entire organization. And often that cost, and I've witnessed it personally, it's the cost of missed opportunity. It's the cost of synergy that can happen when 2 or more folks get together. And so it's easy to ignore conflict. It's easy to say, well, that's just how folks are, and we're not going to touch that. But there is a real cost. And I personally had witnessed and dealt with that within my own area. Some unresolved conflict that went on for a couple of years, and finally I got to the point where it had to be addressed. And I can tell you a year later, after that conflict has been addressed, the outcomes that have come from having addressed that conflict have been absolutely marvelous. And my only regret is that the conflict had not been addressed sooner. And so I often say it's the unspoken words that cause the most damage. And there's some literature around the missed opportunity when words are left unspoken because folks are afraid or nervous. And so kind of in the last 15 minutes or so we have, I want us to think about kind of and get okay with conflict and get okay with the fact that conflict does happen. But it's more important that we take the time to resolve it. So we have to often look at the source of conflict. Where does it come from? Why do we have it? And there is the threat of a conflict, but there's also the threat to, again, missed opportunity, the threat to how folks feel affirmed and safe in the environment because of the conflict. But it's also all human behavior exists to meet a need. So what needs are being met by avoiding addressing the conflict? And so part of the strategy that I often talked about and what I've been taught and have experienced is naming the conflict and being accountable for resolving the conflict. And you got to get past the difficulty and discomfort challenge of the conflict, because ultimately that difficulty and challenge in the moment will pass. And if you do nothing, the conflict remains. And so the last piece here I have here is the notion of detoxifying relationships. Again, that's about naming the behavior and naming the influence of the behavior. And sometimes the conversation can start like this. I'll use my own example. Tom, I notice sometimes when we're in a meeting and Betty mentions a concern about X, I notice sometimes you tend to look away and you roll your eyes. It's been pretty consistent for the past 3 weeks. I'm just curious. I don't know what's going on. Can you help me understand this? Am I perceiving this the same way? And so by doing that, by simply naming it that way, you own what you're witnessing and you open the door for some dialogue. And of course, this is one topic. We could spend an entire webinar just on this topic. I want to sort of end with our second to the last slide. This is the one that, again, could be its own topic. And this is really, I'm just going to kind of share some quick strategies here. We all have multiple demands. We don't have the luxury of just having one thing to do. The number one thing you can do for yourself is to tame your email. One, stop checking all the time. Whatever emails come through, if there is a global emergency, I guarantee someone will tell you. And that emergency will not be conveyed to you via email. Also, limit your response to an email. If you find that you're starting to write a novel, stop writing a novel and pick up the phone, because the last thing you want to do is keep investing the time that it would take. Usually, a 30-second phone call will save at least 10 minutes of emailing. I often share what I call the 80-20 rule. 80% of what you do delivers only 20% of the results, and 20% of what you do delivers 80% of the results. So I find that folks who focus on perfectionism versus excellence don't know about the 80-20 rule. I'm far more effective by focusing on the 20% that makes the most difference in my role. On negotiating ownership, a lot of times we take on issues and projects and problems that don't belong to us, but usually belong to the people we supervise. And so be careful about what you own. I often say the gift is not your gift until you accept it. And so I'm very quick to be careful what tasks I take on. Know how and when to say no. So I mentioned yes earlier. Now I'm talking about saying no. And ultimately, you have limited bandwidth in what you can accomplish. And know that you will disappoint people, and that's okay. Because sometimes you got to say no. And finally, distinguishing between what's important, what's urgent, and what's an emergency. Try to spend most of your time on what's important. Urgency is normally what is urgent for someone else. And in our role, it's likely we do have really emergencies. But when those emergencies happen, we will know what to do. Give you a quick example, and this is very salient. Uh, our campus is in the middle of building a new residence hall, and unfortunately yesterday we experienced a death on campus. One of the construction workers was tragically killed, and that's a true emergency. All the demands I had to deal with prior to finding out about this and having to convene with the president and develop a response to the campus, all those other issues just were no longer an issue because the mindset was on this emergency. So the emergencies will come up and you will handle them. It's the urgent things that can be distracting. So the last thing we'll talk about, and then I want to address a few questions. Prioritizing student needs, knowing that our first priority needs to be creating affirming environments. If we address the environmental concerns and look at the global way of supporting and caring for our students, generally the situations that come up are less likely to happen. And when I say situation versus conditions, conditions are the systemic, larger issues that are affecting a large group of students in some way, shape, or form, or where some students are privileged over others. And that's where we have to be conscious of how we're developing our environments. And even within our own area of influence, whether it's in our residence hall, within our residence community, or the entire campus, we need to be able to assess and distinguish between situations and conditions. And when we see their conditions have a large effect on lots of people, we have to quickly address it. Position, power, or person, sometimes the way in which something gets addressed is by position. Sometimes you have to ask a vice president to do something. Sometimes you have to find the right person in power that may be independent of title. And sometimes it's the individual person. When the individual person is you, you then know you have to act. But when the response is by position or power and you're not one of those two individuals, you have to quickly to be able to leverage your influence to get those folks to act to support student needs. Individual and isolated, global and systemic, that kind of gets back to my earlier point, is being able to distinguish any issues or challenges or even needs that come up, distinguishing between the two. Again, giving time and energy to the global and systemic to reduce the likelihood of there being needs that are going unmet. And finally, consistently inconsistent, knowing that students have different needs and that how we show up in the world influences how we experience the world. And so we have to be always ready to adjust our approach in meeting student needs, knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And we live in a world that when we work in institutions, that if we look at the history of most of our institutions, a lot of us would have never been included to be part of the institutions when our institutions were founded. And so we have to always navigate and negotiate those different aspects. And so I want to quickly, some resources there for that kind of provide some framework for what we discussed today. And I want to quickly answer any questions that come up. And so, Nikki, if you can let me know of any questions that come up. I don't see any so far, but I'd love to answer any questions in the few minutes we have remaining.
Yes, if you have any questions, please write that into the chat box addressing the entire audience or addressing just Thomas Seeger in the chat box, and we will be able to answer your questions. Tom, I have a question here that says, can you tell us a little bit more about a time where you had a huge conflict that you had to either choose, and you had to go against, I believe it says to go against your supervisor's action. So interpretation for me, I would say, is you were told by your supervisor to go ahead to do one way, but you didn't believe that that was the way it should be done, but your supervisor is telling you to go forward with it.
So I can give you a concrete example, and I can share it now because this particular supervisor is no longer here, and I have nothing but respect for this person. But about 5 years ago, when our institution moved towards gender-neutral housing, at the time, the supervisor wanted, and I'll be totally honest, I was still in the same role 5 years ago that I'm in now, and my supervisor wanted to limit gender-neutral housing to just one floor, and really wasn't supportive of going beyond that, and for a lot of different reasons, nothing that reflected her own personal beliefs, so it's more for political reasons. And so I went with that idea the first year, and then once we saw the demand and the need, we decided that we were going to go beyond that. And I was clear to explain the rationale after the fact. I was clear to articulate that any of the previously described concerns were never concerns, they never happened. And also provided a good deal of research from other institutions that showed that this was really a good idea. So I did it with respect, but I also did it with a little bit of kind of an angle towards saying this is really the right thing to do. And so, and I also did it knowing that a year later, the response I would receive would be a lot different from the response I got in the very beginning. So kind of a brief example, but I did kind of go out there a little bit, and luckily it all worked out. Other questions?
I believe there's a question that went to your chat box. Do you see that?
I am looking right now. Actually, I'm not seeing it. Oh, yes, just popped up. So, you know, the question is, in saying yes to collaboration with other areas of the institution, how do you handle conflicts in that regard? I find that if I can position the collaboration as something that will benefit the institution and the individual division involved, usually framing the collaboration in that way reduces any concerns. And if there's conflict within the collaboration, and I'm thinking of examples where I've experienced that conflict, both myself personally and then with my colleagues, usually the conflict is around ideology, and it's around the belief in what's most effective. And for that, we just have to look very objectively. Sometimes we have to refer to the literature. The one advantage that we bring in our own profession is that we generally have a good understanding of what works with students. And so it's not about proving ourselves right, it's about proving what's best for students. Sometimes that means we have to pull out the literature. I'm a big fan of using Ashton's work, looking at how college affects students. Well, actually, I just cross-referenced two different texts. I'm confusing Pasquarello and Terenzini with Ashton, but you know, just looking at those two texts, there's a lot of good overall kind of meta-analysis on what works best, and sometimes just providing that objective point of view can quickly reduce that conflict. But I would also caution, always get your supervisors. Get your supervisor's approval first and articulate why this is a good thing and how that collaboration will not have a negative impact on your work.
Tom, I have one final question. It says, you mentioned to take tasks outside your normal functions, i.e. committees, institutional committees. How do I manage work-life balance when my current workload is already overloaded but need to branch out?
So I would say I would go back to the 80-20 rule, and by the way, I'm more than willing to talk to anyone offline. I'm available by phone, emails, all the above. I would quickly say find the 80% within your current workload that really can be let go. Now, 80% may be too high. Maybe find maybe a handful of things that don't require as much time and attention that you may be giving them. And sometimes it's about negotiating with your supervisor to say that if you want me to be effective and if you want me to grow as a professional, if I'm only focusing on my job, if my job is so demanding that I'm not able to grow as a professional by collaborating with others, then I'm limiting my own growth. If you think about, a lot of you mentioned the desire to advance either to a mid-level position or beyond a mid-level position. One of the most important aspects is your ability to collaborate, because as you advance in your role, you will likely need to be able to collaborate with folks certainly outside your department and oftentimes outside your division. In fact, it's often an expectation that I put on my staff is for that they collaborate outside their division. And so your supervisor is not doing you any favors by not allowing you to work in a way that allows you to collaborate. So you may have to figure out what you can take off your plate, what you can spend less time on, and maybe what strategy you can use to reduce the amount of time you give to every task.
Well, thank you very much. In that, excuse me, we'll end our webinar at this time. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Seeger, for your insight and plan of action. And thank you, viewers, for attending today's webinar. Let's continue the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter at MLCOP ACPA. The next webinar that Dr. Seeger will be conducting will be on October 6th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time or 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, entitled Working Towards Multicultural Organizational Change. We will explore how inequalities continue to exist and discover how to leverage individual and organizational practices to promote multicultural organizational change. Thank you very much for joining us today on today's webinar. Please look forward to a recording of this presentation in about 2 months on the ACPA social media YouTube site. The PowerPoint presentation has been also uploaded to the presentation if you need access to that. You will also receive a survey at the end of this presentation when you close. Please take a moment to fill it out so that MLCOP can better provide to its members and leadership. Thank you very much and enjoy your day. Now, how do I stop the broadcast?